The wind screamed like a dying beast across the ridge, tearing at the pines until their branches cracked like gunfire. Snow came sideways in sheets so thick a man could hardly tell earth from sky. To ride in it was near suicide, but Thomas McCall had long ago stopped fearing what could kill him. The war had taken that from him, taken most things, truth be told, leaving only a hollow rancher with cattle to tend, and a silence so loud it rattled his bones. A man alone had two choices on a day like this: sit by the fire and drink until memory blurred, or face the storm because the herd needed moving. Thomas chose the storm. He hunched low in the saddle, hat brim crusted white, beard rimed with ice. Each breath burned his lungs like swallowing knives. The horse slogged forward, snorting steam, hooves sinking deep with every step. Out here, a body learned to trust its eyes less and its instincts more. For snow had a way of hiding dangers, broken fences, wolf packs, sometimes death itself. That was why, when a strange shape caught Thomas's eye along the tree line, half buried in drift, he almost rode on. A rancher learns not to waste time chasing shadows. But something about the outline made him pull the reins. Too small for a deer, too still for livestock. His gut told him this wasn't animal. He slid from the saddle, boots crunching down, and the cold bit sharper once he left the horse's warmth. Squatting low, he brushed snow aside with a gloved hand. A face appeared, pale and gray as ash, lips cracked, lashes stuck together with frost. Black hair spilled across the drift, stiffened with ice. It was a woman. Young, though suffering aged her, her breath shallow as a dying ember. Her body lay wrapped in rags that might once have been buckskin, though now they were torn and useless against winter's cruelty. For a long beat, Thomas just stared. He'd seen death in every form: the battlefield, cholera, winters that claimed men stronger than oxen. This woman should have been gone hours ago, yet something inside her fought still. He saw it in the faint quiver of her throat, the flicker of breath that refused to vanish. And when her eyes cracked open, dark and gleaming like obsidian stones, he saw defiance burning beneath the fever haze. She spoke then, words low and broken, been good at walking past what others pretended not to see. He crouched again, slipped out of his heavy coat, and wrapped it around her shivering frame. She stirred weakly, her head lolling against his chest. He lifted her with ease. She weighed little more than a bundle of sticks, and felt the heat of fever burning through the thin barrier of cloth. She muttered something against him, words half swallowed, and he found himself whispering back, though she could not understand. "Easy now. You're not dying out here, not tonight." With effort, he hauled her onto his horse, cradling her close against the saddle horn. The mare stamped, uneasy with the weight and the storm, but Thomas swung up behind and pressed his heels in. They turned toward home, snow swallowing the trail behind them. The wind keened across the ridge like a warning, but Thomas didn't look back. Fate had laid something in his path today. Fragile, burning, dangerous. And once a man picked up fate, he didn't get to set it down again. The cabin door slammed back against the wall as Thomas shouldered through, horse sweat and storm clinging to him. Snow gusted in with him, stinging the raw wood floor before the door banged shut again. He carried her as though she weighed no more than a sack of feathers, but his arms trembled with more than exertion. It had been years since he'd felt the press of another heartbeat against his chest. He laid her down on the cot by the hearth, the only softness in that cabin, and for a moment he just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the stranger fate had thrust into his life. The fire had burned low, coals glowing faint red, but he dropped to one knee and shoved kindling in, coaxing flame back to life. Light leapt, chasing shadows up the log walls, until her face came clear. She was young, but not a girl, somewhere in that place between strength and weariness. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips split, her skin fever slick. Dark hair fanned across the rough pillow, streaked with ice that melted in droplets onto the quilt. Her hands were cracked and raw, fingers curled like claws from fighting the cold. She stirred when the warmth touched her, a weak moan escaping her throat. Her eyelids fluttered, and then those black eyes opened, sharp and distrustful even through fever. She looked warmed near the hearth and held it to her cracked lips. "Drink," he urged. She turned her head slightly, suspicion burning through fever, but when the cup touched her mouth, instinct won out. She drank in short, desperate swallows, then coughed, water spilling down her chin. He steadied her with one broad hand behind her shoulders, his palm spanning her fragile bones. When she sank back, he set the cup aside. Her voice came then, hoarse and accented, the words stumbling. "Why? Help me." Thomas blinked. The English was broken but clear enough. For a moment he had no answer. Why had he? He could have ridden past, could have spared himself the weight now pressing on his chest. He thought of the townsfolk, how they'd spit if they knew he had a Cherokee woman under his roof. He thought of the soldiers, men still prowling these hills with hate in their bellies. Then he looked at her again, eyes dark with suspicion, yet lit with the ember of will not yet smothered. "Because someone should," he said at last. The words hung between them, simple and solid as a fence post. She blinked, her gaze softening for a heartbeat, though mistrust quickly shuttered it again. She shifted, the knife hilt still in reach, and Thomas almost smiled at the defiance. Even half dead, she wouldn't surrender. The night deepened around the cabin, storm howling outside like wolves circling prey. Thomas sat back on his heels, watching the rise and fall of her breath. He should have felt regret, dread even, knowing trouble would come of this. Instead, he felt the strangest stirrings of something he had not known in years, purpose. A reason to light the fire higher, to keep watch through the dark hours. She turned her face toward him once more, eyes narrowing. "You, alone?" The question hit harder than a bullet. He nodded once. "Yes." Her lips parted as if to speak again, but whatever words she had vanished into sleep, pulled under by exhaustion. Thomas pulled the quilt higher over her shoulders and sat back in the lone chair by the hearth. He kept the fire alive, the storm raging beyond the walls, while inside that small cabin 2 strangers breathed the same air. One had rescued, the other had yet to decide if she had been saved. Morning came slow, She woke with a shudder, eyes wide and sharp once more, though her body trembled with weakness. When he offered broth, thin, made from what venison and beans he had, she took it with wary hands. She did not thank him, but he did not expect her to. Trust was not a thing freely given on either side of the frontier. She ate sparingly, as if each spoonful were a debt she would one day repay. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Thomas split wood, checked traps, and shoveled snow from the cabin roof while she recovered by the fire. Sometimes, when he returned, he found she had moved from the cot to the chair, her frame wrapped in his coat, staring into the flames, as if she could read her future there. Once, he caught her fingering the seams of the quilt, his late mother's work, patched and worn from years of use. The sight of her touching it sent a strange pang through him, as though his family had reached forward from the grave to witness this moment. She began to speak more, though always with caution. Her English was broken, stitched together from survival, but each word carried weight. She told him her name, Ayoka. He repeated it, careful with the sound, and saw the faintest flicker of pride in her eyes. When he asked how she had come to be out in the storm, she only shook her head. "Not now," she said, voice low. He didn't press. A man who'd seen his share of scars knew better than to dig too deep too soon. Yet little by little, pieces slipped through. Ayoka hummed sometimes when she thought he was outside, low, mournful notes that reminded him of wind in the canyon. One night, as snow drifted soft beyond the window, she whispered of fire. Soldiers who had come to her people's camp, who burned everything she loved. She did not speak of who she had lost, only that the world she knew was ash. Her jaw clenched when she said it, as if speaking itself was a defiance. Thomas had no words of comfort. What could a man say, when his own hands had carried rifles once, when his own war had left nothing but ghosts? Instead, he stoked the fire higher and sat near, letting silence speak for him. Sometimes, silence was the only thing strong enough to hold grief. In turn, she began to ask of him. At first, it was simple. Why alone? The question made his throat tighten. Handle worn smooth by years of grip. Scratched into the wood was a faint design, a bird, wings spread. When she woke and saw it in his hand, she stiffened, anger flashing through her fever-dulled frame. He returned it at once, placing it gently by her fingers. "Yours," he said simply. She stared at him a long while before nodding, her breath easing. That moment planted something unspoken between them, an understanding that her past was hers to guard, not his to take. As the storm days stretched into a week, the space between them softened. Once, while he mended tack by the fire, she reached over and touched the scar on his forearm, a pale rope of flesh from a cavalry saber. He froze, every nerve alive. "War," she said, her eyes searching his. He nodded. She traced it lightly, then pulled back, as if acknowledging the scar without pity, only recognition. It startled him how much that small act steadied him, as though she had seen straight through his armor. And so it went. Small gestures, few words, but something stronger than either of them expected. She laughed once, sudden and surprising, when his old hound tried to climb into her lap. The sound filled the cabin with warmth that fire alone could never give. He found himself watching her more often, not just to guard against fever, but because something in her presence eased the loneliness that had lived in his bones so long. She was still wary, still a shadow of a woman carved by loss. But within that shadow he glimpsed sparks. And Thomas, for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of life beyond survival. The thaw came slow that year, as if winter had grown possessive of the land and refused to let it go. Snow melted into mud, the rivers swelled with ice runoff, and the air carried the bite of lingering frost even when the sun tried to warm it. Thomas had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the season, yet nothing in his life had prepared him for the disruption the woman brought. She had a name now. He had coaxed it from her in fragments, syllables rough and quiet, as though she were afraid the wind might steal them if spoken too loud. "Aita," she said at last, with eyes steady upon him. "It means first to dance." Thomas, who had forgotten how to laugh, hunting knife, examining the blade with the eye of someone who knew how to wield it. Another time he found her at the window, lips pressed tight, watching the tree line as though expecting horsemen to ride through at any moment. And perhaps she was right to fear, for the world beyond those trees was growing restless. Trouble had a way of finding men like Thomas. It came first in the form of smoke seen from the ridge, a column too thick to be brush fire, too gray to be accident. He rode out to investigate, leaving her with strict words to stay inside, though he doubted she would listen. What he found was a settler's homestead burned near to ash. The earth blackened, livestock scattered or slain. The family had been taken, or worse, though signs of struggle left little room for hope. Thomas studied the tracks and found the hooves of cavalry mixed with wagon wheels. He returned home with unease gnawing his gut. Aita saw it in his face before he spoke. She touched the edge of his sleeve and whispered one word in her tongue, something sharp, carrying the sound of grief and rage entwined. He did not need translation. Her people had lived that same fate too many times. And though she did not say it aloud, he knew what lay beneath her silence. This was no place of safety. Not for her, not for him either, should anyone learn he harbored her. The days that followed were strained with unspoken fear. He worked the ranch with double vigilance, eyes always scanning the horizon, rifle never far from reach. She helped where she could, though her strength came back slowly. Still, Thomas noticed her hands remembered tasks he had not expected. Mending tack, tending a fire so it burned steady through night. Even calming the nervous cattle with soft hums of song in her language. The ranch had been nothing but labor before, but with her there, even silence seemed to hold weight. It was no longer empty. It pressed between them, heavy with words unsaid. The first argument broke that silence like a shot. He had ridden into town for supplies, leaving her alone against his better judgment, and returned to find the cabin door unlatched. She sat inside, unharmed, but her expression was hard, her chin lifted in defiance. On the table lay his revolver, dismantled, cleaned, and reassembled with care. He demanded to know why she had touched it, She answered in broken English, "If they come, I fight." The simplicity of it himself. To avoid entanglements, to live quiet. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that vow had already been broken the moment he lifted her from the drift. The conflict tightened like a noose in the days that followed. A pair of riders came to the ranch, strangers with hard eyes and questions about runaways seen near the ridge. Thomas met them at the gate, rifle in hand, his voice steady, though his blood ran hot beneath the surface. He told them nothing, gave them no cause to search, but he felt Aida watching from the window, her presence as loud as thunder in his chest. When the riders left, he found her standing rigid, fists clenched, whispering prayers in her tongue. He wanted to tell her it was over, that the danger had passed, but even he knew that was a lie. In the quiet after, as dusk fell and coyotes howled on the hills, Thomas realized the truth of his situation. He was no longer merely a rancher. He was a man caught between two worlds, the life he had clung to in solitude, and the new life her presence threatened to shape. The danger was growing, and with it, the bond between them. Whether it led to ruin or redemption, Thomas knew only this: he could no longer turn away. The storm of trouble they both felt brewing finally broke in late spring, when the hills wore green again and the cattle grazed belly deep in grass. The sun had been warm all day, the air smelling of sage and thawed earth, but Thomas's chest carried a weight that no brightness could burn away. Riders had been spotted near the southern ridge. Neighbors whispered of soldiers and hired trackers combing the land. Rumors rode faster than bullets in those days. A Cherokee widow escaped from a camp, vengeance sought by men who considered mercy weakness, justice nothing but fire and rope. And though Thomas said little to Aida, her sharp eyes read the truth in him as plainly as if it were branded on his skin. The night they came was moonless, dark as the pit of a well. Thomas had been restless all day, his nerves stretched taut, every sound of hoof or coyote on the wind setting him on edge. He cleaned his rifle twice, checked the revolver 3 times, and laid extra wood by the door. Aida watched him with quiet patience, as though she already knew what was written in the hours to come. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, low, carrying that taken again. The first sound was the crunch of hooves, slow and deliberate, drawing close. Then came voices, rough with drink and cruelty. Thomas slipped to the window, rifle cradled in his arms, and saw the silhouettes. 5 men, maybe 6, dismounting in the yard. Their leader, broad-shouldered with a cavalry coat hanging loose, called out into the night, "We're looking for a runaway. Word is she was seen near these parts. No need for trouble. Just hand her over and we'll be on our way." His voice carried the smug confidence of men who believed themselves the law. Thomas felt Aida's presence at his back, a shadow close enough that he could feel her breath. She whispered one word in her tongue, sharp and bitter. He didn't ask the meaning, he could hear the hate in it. For a moment he thought of refusing to answer, of staying silent until they moved on. But he knew men like this, they did not leave empty-handed. Silence was an invitation for them to take what they wanted. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle held loose but ready, the cold air biting his face. The men turned, grins curling in the firelight of their torches. "Evening, boys," Thomas said evenly. "Ain't seen no one pass through here but cattle and wind." The leader's grin widened. "Funny thing, neighbors down the ridge said otherwise. Said a squaw's been keeping here. Hard to miss black hair against white snow." He took a step closer, boots crunching. "Now we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. You know as well as I, harboring an Injun ain't something folks take kindly to." Something in Thomas broke then, the old vow of silence, of keeping his head down, of living quiet. He had carried that weight for years, but Aida's presence had cracked it open. He thought of her lying half dead in the snow, of the fire in her eyes when she cleaned his revolver, of the way her voice softened when she sang to the cattle in her tongue. He thought of all the times he should have acted in his life but didn't, and he knew tonight would not be added to that list. "I reckon folks can take kindly or not," Thomas said, voice steady as stone. "But she's not yours to claim. Not tonight, not ever." The silence that followed was return fire, each pull of the trigger a vow to keep standing. Aitia was beside him then, hair wild, eyes blazing, pressing her small frame against his as if daring death to take them both. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay still. 2 staggered into the dark, cursing and broken. The leader remained, bleeding from a wound at his side, but grinning all the same. He raised his pistol, sight steady on Aitia. Thomas, half dazed with blood loss, tried to raise his rifle, but his arms failed him. For a heartbeat, time froze, the torchlight flickering, Aitia's breath ragged, the man's finger tightening on the trigger. Then Aitia stepped forward. She moved not with fear, but with the quiet grace of someone who had already died once and would not be broken again. Her shot cracked the night, clean and final. The leader dropped, his pistol slipping into the mud. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of torches dying in the dirt. The fight was over. But Thomas, slumped against the porch post, felt the cold creeping through him, darker than any winter storm. His vision swam, blood soaking his shirt, each breath a battle. Aitia knelt beside him, pressing her hands hard against the wound, murmuring words he didn't understand. Her voice trembled, though her eyes did not. "Stay," she whispered finally in English, her voice breaking. "Stay with me." Thomas tried to answer, but managed only a ragged breath. He thought of the vow he'd made years ago, to live alone, to keep to himself. And he thought of the vow he made tonight, unspoken but carved into his soul, to stand beside her no matter the cost. If this was the price, he would pay it. Yet, as darkness pulled at him, he felt the warmth of her hands, the steady rhythm of her breath, the fierce will in her that had carried her through every trial. And for the first time in years, he believed he might not have to carry his burdens alone. The night was littered with bodies, the cabin pocked with bullet holes, the land scarred with violence. But in the ruin, a bond had been forged in blood and fire. Whether Thomas survived the wound or not, something greater had taken root between them, something no bullet could shatter. Dawn came slow, bleeding gray light across the valley, touching the wreckage of the night with a pale, merciless hand. Speech. In those first days after the fight, silence ruled between them. It was not the silence of strangers, sharp and uneasy, but the silence of 2 who had bled together, who no longer needed every thought spoken aloud. Aida cared for him with a quiet ferocity, boiling herbs she gathered from the hillside, forcing bitter teas past his lips when he would rather spit them out. He caught her once sewing the torn flesh at his shoulder with a needle and thread meant for mending tack. Her hands trembled, yet she did not stop until the work was done. Pain made him groan, curse, sweat, but she met his gaze without flinching, as if daring him to break before she did. When it was over, he whispered her name, not loud, just enough for her to hear. She answered with the ghost of a smile, weary but unbowed. Outside, the land shifted from spring to early summer. Grass grew thick again, rivers swelled, and calves bawled in the pasture. Life pressed forward with no regard for wounds or loss. Yet Thomas knew the world beyond his fence line was not finished with them. The riders who fled that night would carry tales, perhaps seek vengeance. Word of what happened would not die easy. Still, as days stretched into weeks, the fear eased its grip. He found strength returning, slow but steady. He could sit at the table again, could step outside to watch the sun sink over the ridge, Aida at his side. Each small victory felt like a defiance of death, and each glance she gave him was a reminder that he had not fought in vain. One evening, when the sky blazed gold and the meadow swayed with wildflowers, he spoke what had weighed on him since that night. "You had chance to run," he said quietly. "When I was down, when the bullets flew, you could have left me. But you stayed." Aida's eyes held his, dark and unflinching. She shook her head once, hair falling loose around her face. "I not run again," she said, her words careful, each one carrying more than its weight. "I ran before, always run. No more." She pressed her hand lightly against his bandaged shoulder. "You stay." "I stay." The simplicity of it struck Thomas harder than poetry. He had lived his life building fences, drawing lines, keeping people out. She, who had lost everything, spoke of staying as if it were the bravest thing in the world. Perhaps it was itself in smaller ways. in the way she placed an extra biscuit on his plate, though food was scarce, in the way he fixed the latch on the cabin door so she could sleep without fear, in the way her hand brushed his when passing a cup, lingering just long enough to say what neither had dared yet to speak. Summer deepened, and with it came peace Thomas had not known since boyhood. The scars of battle faded, though never vanished, and the land seemed to breathe easier around them. One morning, Aita stood on the ridge at dawn, watching the valley spread below. Thomas joined her, and together they saw the river shining, the fields wide and endless. For the first time, he did not see emptiness in that expanse. He saw possibility. "I used to think this land cursed," he admitted, voice low, "full of ghosts that wouldn't let me be. But now, it feels different." Aita's hand slipped into his, warm and sure. "Not cursed," she said. "Waiting. For us." The words settled deep in him, heavier than any oath. He looked at her then, truly looked, not as the woman he had pulled from snow, not as the burden he feared to carry, but as the partner he had chosen without realizing it. Her face was still marked by hardship, her eyes shadowed by loss. But there was light in her too, fierce and unyielding. And Thomas, a man who had once sworn to walk alone, felt something crack open inside. A tenderness he thought long dead, blooming like wildflowers after storm. As the sun lifted over the ridge, painting the land gold, Thomas McCall knew the fight was not done. Danger still prowled the edges of their world, and the past would not vanish like smoke. But he also knew this: they had faced death together and lived. They had chosen each other in the fire, and in the wide, untamed silence of the frontier, that choice was worth more than any vow. The seasons turned again as they always did, but for Thomas and Aita, the world no longer felt like a place to merely endure. By autumn, the fields glowed gold with grass, the cattle fattened strong, and the cabin, once scarred by bullets, stood mended, its walls steadied by more than timber. It stood on trust, on quiet laughter, on the choice they had made together, something that felt near to sacred. On the last night before winter's breath returned to the ridge, they stood again on the rise above the ranch. The sky flamed with dying light, and the first snowflakes spun down slow, gentle as blessings. Thomas reached for her hand, rough palm to delicate fingers, and neither spoke. They didn't need to. The land stretched wide before them, untamed and unforgiving, yet theirs to face together. In silence, they made their vow, not in church, not in law, but in love carved against the endless west.